Welcome to the We as Nature podcast, where inspiring visionaries share their personal stories of living in alignment with the more than human world, and how this informs their unique contribution to cultivating a flourishing future for life on Earth. Each month, We as Nature features a new storyteller, sharing their experience of how listening to and learning from diverse forms of life has altered their course. The power of story lies within each of us, offering a portal to the language of the heart, connecting us to our feelings as a source of inspiration and courage from which we can act. For those of us seeking to create a flourishing world, starting right where we are, these We as Nature stories offer a space to listen, contemplate, and envision new possibilities. We as Nature is brought to you by Flourishing Diversity, and you can find out more about who we are and what we do at the end of the episode, as well as in the show notes. Today, we're delighted to welcome acclaimed folk singer Sam Lee, sharing his journey of becoming a song collector and nature conservationist, and how these seemingly different worlds weave together as one. In his story, Sam delves into the early years of his affinity with the natural world and the path that led him to one of his most unique musical abilities, making music in collaboration with birds. Sam has spent 15 years regalvanising the sight, sound and ecosystem of folk arts in the UK through his projects and live shows, with 3 critically acclaimed albums, including his debut, which received a Mercury Music Prize nomination. Sam's also a founding member of Music Declares Emergency and board member of the Featured Artist Coalition, working to get the UK music industry to net zero. He's the founder and director of the Nest Collective, which, amongst many other beautiful offerings, hosts pilgrimages and nature immersions. And last year, he published his first book, The Nightingale, Notes on a Songbird, which dives deep into some of the rich stories and experiences that he'll be sharing with us today. Through music, pilgrimage and storytelling, Sam has developed intimate connections with the nightingale, the turtle dove and the salmon, all of which have shaped his earthly relationships. It is with his uplifting and nourishing spirit that Sam brings his story to life for us today.
The song of the male nightingale in courtship song there, and that's a recording made in 2018. It's an improvisation, and you heard the banjo playing of Cosmo Sheldrake, the accordion, the button accordion of Tommy Blackroth, and I'm on the Indian Shruti underneath as well. And it was recorded in Kent on one of the many nights that I spend out in the woods with doing my Singing with Nightingales project. And that bird was about 10 feet above us, singing exceptionally loud, where they do this incredible collaboration with human musicians. And when you bring in an instrument, the nightingales will respond. They'll hear the key and the rhythm and start to adapt their way of singing. And we're able to create this extraordinary, in the complete darkness of night, this kind of ritual. It's my most beloved time of the year are those spring nights with nightingales. But to say a little bit about how did I come to discover this magical realm of nightingales and their amazing relationship with humans, not just in this country, but internationally. And my discovery of the nightingales kind of has come from a long journey of nature loving, being very involved and present in nature throughout my entire life. I was very fortunate. And I'll, if I may indulge in a little bit of a journey into how I came to be this wrangler of nightingales and this leader of pilgrimages, and doing everything I can to connect us as humans in community with our brother and sister species. And it started with a very lucky opportunity as a little kid. I grew up in Kentish Town in the borough of Camden in central London, which is not where people who spend a life living with nature generally start off. But I was fortunate enough to be sent off as a kid to some summer camps, an organisation called Forest School Camps. And it was a very old, it's 80 years old, a community broke away from the Scouts, a radical left-wing organisation that had a very beautiful philosophy, achieving its kind of ideas and ideologies from a mixture of Steiner and Native American and Baden-Powell and all these kind of concepts of freedom of the child, the autonomous right to explore and discover, and allowance of curiosity for kids to be in nature and how to build community within nature. And these camps were very formative as a child. They were rich in woodcraft skills, fire lighting, and self-sufficiency, but also ritual and ceremony and rites of passage that a kid didn't really get the opportunity growing up in a pretty rough bit of central London. And it also had a very strong campfire singing tradition. And from this, I as a teenager became absolutely at home in nature. I wasn't a very popular kid at school, and found sanctuary in bits of nature, be that Hampstead Heath or running off into bits of North London to the fields. And through my books and learnings, and eventually becoming a student of Ray Mears, became very involved in the wilderness work, survival as we used to call it, but what I call nature connection now, self-sufficiency. And that led me into becoming a teacher and leading kids and adults into kind of nature connection work. But all the while I had this great love of music and songs, and the songs that we'd sung as a kid, I didn't really know where they'd come from. There are a few kind of 60s, 70s, anthems from the folk revival and the protest movements, and songs we all know from Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell. But there was lots of these songs that seemed to go back to times before that I didn't hear growing up in London. They weren't part of my family culture or social culture. And I had a very mongrel, intake of music from many different cultures and genres. And it was on the advent of the internet, I started to research these songs and discovered this indigenous music of Great Britain. I've been listening to the tribal music of many different cultures and countries. I studied anthropology in night school at Birkbeck and ethnomusicology in night classes, and had really fascinated by devotional music in different communities, but had no idea that Britain and the British Isles, I should say, including Ireland within that, had our own ancient devotional, occasionally ritualistic and secular / sacred song. And it's through those songs that I started to research them that I discovered our folk tradition, folk music, as we call it, in this very sort of, polite way. And that was it. Age 25, I threw myself down the well of folk music. I stopped playing all my rock and roll and blues records and soul and R&B, and I just listened purely to archival recordings, field recordings made of old farmers and sailors and milkmaids made in the wax cylinders from 1905 through to the reel-to-reels of the 1950s of the old song collectors. And I learned as many songs as I could, and went to the Cecil Sharp House Library in Camden Town, which is our folk archive and sound archive. But it wasn't until I, by chance, met an old man, a Scottish traveller, one of the last of the Scottish gypsy traveller community, bit of gypsy blood in him, but of the ancient lineage of Scots travellers who've been an indigenous nomadic people of the Scottish kind of hills and highlands for thousands of years, with their own language and their own kind of musical and folkloric and bardic traditions. And Stanley Robertson was the last surviving member, one of the three last surviving members, but then became the last surviving member of that community to carry this highly rich and profound tradition, repertoire, but also the knowledge of the songs, of what they meant and what it meant to sing them and to be a song carrier. And this was something I'd only read about in books and could guess at listening to old recordings that were made of people who were long dead. And all the academics that I met and all the folklorists and all the, you know, the people doing the academic work in folk music had insisted that all those old singers had passed away. There was no more songs to collect. That age had long passed, and we'd lost all our elders and our song carriers, as is the name. Our source singers, they're called, this very technical term in the folk music world. And as a 25, 26-year-old, I was dismayed by this. And I was like, there's no way it's all gone and it's disappeared and there's nothing left. And meeting Stanley certainly was the beginning of this, meeting a great, like meeting a sort of brontosaurus, you know, someone that didn't exist in that way. And he took me on as his apprentice, and for the 4 years of his life, and this is a much bigger story, not for now, I had this extraordinary journey in the tutelage of learning what it meant to sing these songs, the responsibility, and to be a keeper of the law, as was his name, for our role, people who carry song. And he taught me, very importantly, the spiritual connection to these songs, of what it meant to connect him with ancestors and all these things that were never spoken about in the folk music world. Very much it's a sort of a maintaining of tradition, but for him it was about a spiritual, ancestral rite and lineage that needed to be evoked. And there was a lot of supernatural in that, a lot of mysticism. And it was a very profound 4 years of my apprenticeship. And from that, I went on to go and search out for other singers who might know songs. And I never met anyone like Stanley, who had quite that breadth of repertoire and that rather extraordinary psychic and otherworldly, ancient worldly relationship. But what I did find, particularly in Ireland and with the Irish travellers and the English gypsies, was many of the elders, most of whom now have passed on, who really were and the last keepers of old song. And I did 15 years of recording these songs and being a song collector. And I have an archive where the digital archive of many of those singers and songs, ancient songs, some of which go back, 1,000, 2,000 years old, still being sung unbroken through the oral tradition. It's an incredible repertoire that the British Isles has, one of the most vast melodic traditions in the world, and very unique in this country for being a song tradition that is only one singer, one song, no instrumentalism played in collaboration. That's very much of Europe and beyond. In Britain, the singer sings the song solo, unaccompanied. And so we have this vast song repertoire. And I was very fortunate to discover many songs and record many songs that would have gone to the grave unheard, undiscovered, versions of songs we'd have never heard, lyrics and melodies that would have disappeared. And there were privileged times of me essentially going into wonderful exchange with the elders of these lands, people who were born in caravans, in tents, lived barefoot for many decades of their lives, and lived a very close proximity to nature. And for me, there was something that I really connected with, because as a singer that I'd become, as a recording artist, and somebody got into the music industry, I stepped away from my nature work to pursue the listenership, the recording experience, the gigging, and the song collecting was my time. It's supposedly in the field where I was out, not doing the kind of the work that other musicians did. It was my research, but ultimately it was my practice as well. It was how I learned, how I felt connected to the songs. But what came from that was many years of not doing my regular being out in nature, spending my summers living close to the land, living in my tent. And I got very sick. I got very unwell in my heart from that. And I went through a sort of a realization of what I'd left behind. I was actually getting kind of nature deficit disorder, if you want to call it, for want of a better term. But I knew that I wasn't being resourced and I wasn't being nourished by actually my first great love, of being with nature and also being with people in nature. And that was my sacrifice. And luckily I had a realization of this and identified ways of getting closer to nature and bringing it more into my musical practice. And this was, maybe about 6-7 years ago, at a time where I was really beginning to become aware of how much nature was being lost in the British Isles. We were already well aware of the climate change and ecological collapse situation, but in terms of seeing it happen on our own doorsteps. And I was so aware, as I was going back repeatedly to parts of the country that I knew very well, Sussex, Wales, the Lake District, Scotland, I was seeing a diminishment in the natural, the baseline, as we call it, how fewer birds were singing, how species of plants were not present, other species of plants had come in prolific amounts, and rivers were being choked up. The River Wye is a river I'd grown up with, and how absolutely destroyed it was becoming. A river I used to catch white-clawed crayfish in, now ostensibly extinct in that river and many other rivers, as well as eels and things that were just no more. The salmon had stopped running. All these things had disappeared that I was so aware of as being part of the landscape that I'd grown up with. And I'm only 42 years old, so I've not had an exceptionally long life yet. And in these experiences of trying to find ways to get closer to nature, I was introduced to the nightingale. And this was one of the most profound moments of my life, hearing a nightingale sing for the first time, a bird that I knew so well by name, but never aware of in terms of what the song actually is. That started me on a journey of annual going on pilgrimages on my own to listen to the nightingales. And somehow every year I would find an opportunity to go and listen to these birds sing. And it was always me as an audience member. And the long story short was that in 2014, I worked with the BBC to make a documentary on Radio 4 about the 90th anniversary of Beatrice Harrison, our famous cellist, who had pioneered the first outside live broadcast on radio ever, which is actually was quite a media sensation and a breakthrough in terms of how arts and culture could be broadcast. And she pioneered this with her cello in her garden and a nightingale with her, improvising with a nightingale, a little bit like the music we heard at the start. And that was had always been a very powerful bit of old recording made, 1924. And I made this homage to that moment, and we broadcast it on exactly to the hour in which that broadcast had happened 90 years later. But in the making of that documentary, I brought some musicians into the woods with me in Sussex, where I lead my Sing with Nightingales projects today. And we started singing and playing, and I'd never done that. And this nightingale that we were right next to started to sing back. I was expecting the bird to stop singing and fly off, but actually, to the contrary, he started improvising with us. And this was one of those kind of life-changing moments. We were like, oh my God, this is the most phenomenal thing I've ever experienced as a musician, as a human. People have to hear this. So, you know, if you can't bring Muhammad to the mountain, you bring the mountain to Muhammad. And so I decided that actually maybe this little blackthorn thicket in Sussex is a wonderful concert venue, and developed these nights where I bring audiences, 35 people a night, for 6 weeks while the birds sing their courtship song. We go and sit with the Nightingales and play music. And it's become a ritual, an annual ritual. I live nocturnally in the woods, watch the spring come in, and it's become my lifeline to living in nature. But it's also become a blueprint for experiences that are transformative, that are ways of, for those of us who haven't been able to, or one reason or another do not have the access to nature that we need to be humans, to be sensory, sensitive people. It's a wonderful kind of shot up the arm. It's a phenomenal way of being just dunked by your, head first into the cauldron of nature at her most prolific, expressive, and forgiving as well, and accepting in the exquisite moments that are springtime nights, the stillness of these cool evenings. And that blueprint has led on to me working in many different creative ways through the Nest Collective, but with pilgrimages and but also other different projects, and particularly my own music, where the folk songs that I sing, I gravitate now very much towards the music and the repertoires that are connecting in with the ancient stories of relationship to nature, because we've so much to learn from the songs and from our ancestors and from the old wisdoms that we haven't lost. Everyone thinks has died and gone. Actually, it hasn't. On a collective basis, we have a wonderful access to and living repositories of British Indigenous knowledge, herbal knowledge, the apothecary knowledge, the druidic knowledge, the mythic stories of our land, and the old pathways and the magical connections that we have. There are so many brilliant people. What we don't have is a culture of exchange and passing down. It's changing, and rapidly we're living in a time where this country is becoming more and more connected and educated, and encouraged to go and find ways of us individually connecting to nature in the ways that we have. What the difficulty is that I find is that everyone has their own relationship. It's like finding a husband or a wife or a lover with nature. And I often think of it like that, that everyone's got their own unique way of being with nature. And we have this kind of thing called recreation, which I think is the most kind of dull and beige word in the whole of the English language. And, being in nature is about going for a walk or climbing a mountain or riding a bicycle, that these are what we've been permitted to do within the confines of our rather corrupt and ruined land access. And I could go on about the issues of right to roam and lack of access, and the footpath conundrum of how actually as humans we aren't able to be in nature, apart from in Scotland where we have the right to roam. In England, we have a great crisis of people not being able to do the journeying with nature and having the time and the intuition or the kind of the sense of empowerment, of permission to go and find their love, their relationship, their sacred and devotional connection. Whatever it is, be it sacred and devotional, or be it very practical and, on a very kind of, physical, real, visceral level. And I'm very keen that there are as many opportunities for people, and we're seeing this blossoming realm of experiences and the rewilding movement and all the different ways that spaces are being opened up and inviting people to come and find their sense of joy and wonder. For me, it's about the re-enchantment of nature. And music is an extraordinarily powerful way in by partaking in music, by being in a place of listening to music, it's one of the ways that we can most support our senses, particularly obviously our ears, but also not just our ears, our sort of vibrational attunement of what music conjures up within ourselves emotionally and what that precipitates within our bodies. And there is no better place for listening to music, I don't believe, than in the natural settings, particularly if it's in sympathy and harmony with other species. And so this has become my kind of purpose in life, taking the wisdom that I received from Stanley Robertson, the Scots traveller, in his teaching and of how to hold your art and how to share it, and the important that it's done within a strong and resilient and diverse community, and that it's open to all. And for me, that's been my mantra of how the work I do, particularly in hosting concerts, my campfire clubs, the concerts around the country, bringing audiences around the fire. Fire for me is a really critical, alchemical focal point for communities, and the loss of fire from society, I think, has had a profound effect in the dissolving of our bonds between us. And it's a wonderful place. It's the ancient place from where we as humans started. So so that's very much my these are my tools that I work with, and then how I embody that for me in my concerts and the work that I do as an artist, and my recordings when they are in more, in people's headphones and on computers and not in wilderness. How can I distill these essences of being in nature and what I receive from being in those places? How can I transform that into the CD, the MP3? These are the challenges as an artist. But for me, most importantly, it's about the empowering of people to go and find their own way of doing it. So with all that said, in terms of my ramble of ambitions, and I can talk for hours and hours on this in all the different amazing ways that it needs to happen, and how we listen to our elders, particularly both our elders of these islands, but also beyond, and how we are in an amazing time for receiving wisdom from all over. But I just want to read this page and a bit this is my book, that Nightingale Notes on a Songbird, which tells my story and many of the European and Northern Hemisphere stories of the nightingale. That's the principal bird in so many different cultures. And this is my vision of a one day of how our relationship with nightingales, or maybe other species, could be. I have long dreamed there to be one utterly fanciful and romantic way that this call to bond further with nature and the nightingales and all their legacy of appreciation might take hold amongst friendship groups and families. I like to imagine that one day, in a not too distant future, a ritual will exist annually every spring. And England, having as many nightingales as it did before the 1960s, that is in the hundreds of thousands, we're now down to just 5,500 pairs left today, set to go extinct within the next 40 years, we will experience, come early May, an exodus of people from their homes to go and do a nightingale. Families and friends, couples and singletons, grandparents and grandchildren, community groups, work colleagues, whoever it pleases, will gather on gentle, dry nights with flasks of hot tea, snacks, maybe even a bottle of port or whiskey, blankets, and at around 9 p.m, will leave their homes or the pub, or drive many hundreds of miles even, to head out to a nightingale hotspot. On the journey, stories will be told of when each person first heard the nightingale's song, and how wonderful it will be to hear this bird again after a long, cold winter. When the destination is reached, a silence will fall upon the group, like when the lights go down at a concert, and a hush will reign. Intrepid steps are made from the car into the brush to get close to a bird as quietly as possible. And when he is reached, blankets are spread and everyone cozies up to one another to start listening. I imagine this scene like an English equivalent of a Burns night, but informally arranged on the leafy floor amongst the hyacinthine scent of bluebells. There are kids curled up on parents' laps, friends resting their heads on each other's bellies or leaning back to back. After a while of just listening to the nightingales sing, out of someone's pocket comes an old tattered notebook with scraps of paper. Maybe it's been handed down from a late parent or gifted from a godmother when they were young. A phone light is discreetly turned on, and in hushed, reverential voices, poems and songs and rounds and prose are recited or sung upwards towards our nightingale. Every offering is an heirloom received, found, or chosen along life's way, savoured as being perfect for this annual moment. The opportunity to share something is passed around for everyone who wants to give a sonnet or recitation. An improvised sharing evolves, unique to those present and to each year's mood. Some sharings are sombre and mournful, others are comical, with muted sniggers and irreverences. Some people are formal, others are casual. Some are drunk, others are stoned. Some are erotic, some are lonely. Some are romantic, some are in remembrance, and some are in prayer. But all are in celebration of this bird and of ourselves as sentient, sensitive beings, grateful for what might not have survived.
We hope you enjoyed Sam's story as much as we did. If you'd like to find out more about Sam, about singing with the Nightingales, about his book and other projects, check out the links in the show notes, where you'll also find the music featured at the start of this episode. And finally, a small request. If you enjoy the We as Nature podcast, you can help others hear it by spreading the word and by leaving us a review. Thanks for being here, and see you next time. The We as Nature podcast is recorded live during an online gathering where each month a new guest shares their story and attendees enjoy the opportunity to connect with other listeners. You can find a link to our upcoming We as Nature live events, which are free to attend, in the show notes. We as Nature is brought to you by Flourishing Diversity, an initiative bringing together voices from all over the world to explore humanity's interconnection with the lands, waters, forests and fellow species. Flourishing Diversity is a path towards a vibrant future and offers a collective approach in response to climate breakdown and biodiversity loss. We create spaces to listen to and learn from all life, raise critical questions, search for alternative answers, and amplify generative biocultural practices. You can register to receive updates and inspiration from us at flourishingdiversity.com, as well as finding us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. All the links are in the show notes. Thanks for being here, and we hope you'll join us again soon.